When it comes to Fire Emblem Three Houses, one of the game's most defining traits is its immersive storyline. After playing all of the routes, it is made clear that many aspects of the game's lore are based on actual events in world history. That is why in this video, I am here to show you all of the connections I was able to make between world history and the lore of Fire Emblem Three Houses. These connections will include comparing in-game factions to real-life nations, comparing characters to historical figures, comparing game design, and many more similarities. So, if you wish to know the real-life inspiration behind the story of Three Houses, please sit back and enjoy the video. Since I'll be going into great depth on the game's lore, please know that spoilers for all the routes will be shown. Timestamps for the video's information will also be posted in the description. With that being said, let us begin. Fodlan's various nations and alliances are vital in shaping the game's core conflicts. After digging through the game's lore, it is made clear that Fodlan's countries and factions are very much counterparts to the nations of our medieval and even ancient times, most of them from Europe and Asia. So for the first part of this video, I'll show you how the factions of Fodlan compare to those of the real world. The Church of Seiros holds both great religious and even political influence in the continent of Fodlan. That's why I'll be comparing it to that of the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was not only religious, but had political dominance during Europe's medieval and early modern times. One common example of political power held by both the Catholic Church and the Church of Seiros was the process of coronation. In medieval and early modern Europe, it was only Catholic authority who was legally recognized to crown a monarch. This process is also seen in Fodlan, since it is only the Archbishop of the Church of Seiros who could crown the monarch of the empire or the kingdom. Additionally, practices in the real Catholic Church included building monasteries. This is where literate monks could write and preserve their religious teachings. These practices of the Catholic Church were also upheld by the members of its complex hierarchy. Of course, Garrigmach Monastery is a clear analogy to this Catholic practice, as it is populated by monks, nuns, priests, and cardinals who wear similar garbs to their Catholic counterparts. Above all those ranks, however, is the Archbishop, which is Fire Emblem's version of the Pope. Besides the clergy, the Knights of Seiros seem to be Fire Emblem's reflection to the Catholic Knights Templar, since both of them were the private militaries of their respective churches. The Knights Templar was the Catholic private military that fought off the church's enemies, such as the Muslim Caliphate during the Crusades of the 12th century. In a similar manner, the Knights of Seiros was used to fight off the Church of Seiros' enemies, which included Nemesis, the Almyrans, and other factions throughout the game. However, both the medieval Catholic Church and the Church of Seiros have done some questionable things to maintain their political power. One such example for the Catholic Church was the indulgence tax, where the church told its people to pay even more money with the false promise that their extra funds will shorten their family's time in purgatory. In order to prevent the common citizens from finding out that the indulgence tax was unbiblical, the church used exclusively Latin Bibles, since Latin was not a language that commoners understood. This is very similar to how the Church of Seiros rewrote the history of the War of Heroes in order to preserve the societal structure of crests in Fodlan. In addition, both the Catholic and Seiros churches had policies regarding censorship. The medieval Catholic Church possessed a book known as the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or the Index of Prohibited Books, that Rome labeled as heresy.
Heresy, Legions! Unacceptable!
In a similar manner, the Church of Seiros had an underground library filled with banned books deemed as heresy by Sedith. Perhaps one of the most relevant similarities between these two churches was the use of relics. In Verdant Wind and Silver Snow, we learned that the heroes' relics are truly the body parts of the Nabatean dragon race, which was slaughtered by Nemesis. It seems like a gruesome concept to have the remains of Rhea's brothers and sisters, including her mother's spine, to be counted as sacred relics. But what if I told you that the Catholic Church also used body parts as relics? Whereas the Church of Seiros classified the body parts of Nabateans as relics, the Catholic Church classified the organic remains of saints and popes as relics. Some examples of this include the skeletons of Saint Magnus and Saint Bonosa, the arm of Saint Valerie, and the blood of Pope John Paul II, just to name a few. Since we got the Church of Seiros out of the way, let's compare Fodlan's pre-existing civilization to their real-world counterpart, that being the Nabateans. The Nabateans in the game were the ancient race of green-haired and green-eyed humanoids who had the ability to turn into dragons at certain times. Their home was an old desert-like city called Xanadu, the Red Canyon. In real life, there was a real group of people called the Nabateans, who were a group of Arab merchants that could be traced to what is now modern-day Jordan. Perhaps their biggest similarity to Fodlan's Nabateans is their home. In the deserts of Jordan, the home of the real ancient Nabateans was Petra, a city famous for the ruins of buildings carved right into the mountains. The home of the real Nabateans seems to be recreated in Xanadu, since they are both ancient desert cities carved right from stone. In this next segment, we'll start connecting Fodlan's three main countries to real-life nations. Let's start with Adrestia, the oldest and largest of the three. After researching the lore of the Black Eagle's homeland, I've come to the conclusion that the empire is Three Houses' counterpart to Germany, which was known as the Holy Roman Empire during medieval times. So here are my reasons why they are so similar. Before Germany was the unified country we see today, the people we consider to be German used to be a large ethnic group spread across Europe, known as the Germanic tribes. These included Anglo-Saxons, Belgae, Franks, and much more. However, the Germanic tribes that once sprawled all across Europe settled into their own land and created their own countries. These included the Anglo-Saxons creating England, the Belgae turning into Belgium, Franks into France, and many more. Why did I mention this, you ask? Well, the history I just mentioned is a direct comparison to the history of Fodlan's Adrestian Empire. Just like the Germanic tribes, the empire once sprawled all across their continent, and over time, the people throughout Fodlan founded their own independent countries. Now that I've compared the Adrestian Empire to the Germanic people as a whole, let's compare it to Germany in specific. Like I said earlier, medieval Germany was known as the Holy Roman Empire, first ruled by King Charlemagne, who was crowned by the Pope and given the title Holy Roman Emperor. This fragmented union of German states was also called the Holy Roman Empire due to the hopes of recreating the once glorious ancient Roman Empire. What I've explained is very much emulated in the lore of the Adrestian Empire. Pope Leo II gave King Charlemagne the religious title of the Holy Roman Emperor in an attempt to unify the fragmented German states. Similarly, Saint Seiros also gave the sacred title of Adrestian Emperor to Edelgard's ancestor, Emperor Wilhelm, in hopes of unifying a divided Fodlan under the Church in order to defeat Nemesis and the elites. Speaking of Wilhelm, Edelgard's ancestor is not only similar to King Charlemagne in terms of how the two gained power, but he also shares the name with Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Germany during World War I. Furthermore, in addition to being a direct comparison to Germany or Holy Roman Empire, the Adrestian Empire could be a direct relation to the original ancient Roman Empire. Adrestia's similarity to the Roman Empire could be seen in its fragmentation. Just like how the once great Roman Empire is now a series of independent countries, the once enormous Adrestian Empire split up into independent countries we see in Fodlan today. So far, I've compared the Adrestian Empire mostly to Germany, and to some extent the Roman Empire, but there is some evidence to prove that Adrestia is an allusion to both Rome and Germany, that evidence being their national animal. In fact, both Germany and Adrestia have the same national animal, which is the black eagle. Most real-life countries that choose the eagle as their national animal do it to pay homage to Rome. Germany used the eagle since they were originally named the Holy Roman Empire, and Russia adopted the double-headed eagle as their national animal since Russia once called itself the Third Rome. Perhaps the biggest similarity between Adrestian and German history has to do with their churches. Germany was where monk Martin Luther started to rebel against the Catholic Church by starting the Protestant Reformation. This gave birth not only to many Protestant non-Catholic religions, but also to many wars that would be fought between Catholics and Protestants. Similarly, Adrestia was where Edelgard, much like Martin Luther, began to rebel against the Church, starting a full-scale religious war against the Church of Seiros, just like in Europe. Besides the German-like history, Adrestia does indeed have German and Germanic names among its inhabitants. Edelgard is German for noble protector, Linhart is Lionheart, Hubert is ironically a bright spirit, Dorothea is a gift of God, Caspar is keeper of treasure, and many of the last names even fit the German standard. Even Byleth seems to have a German-sounding last name, since Eisner sounds a lot like Eisenhower. Furthermore, if you still wish to connect Adrestia to Rome, you could use Constance, since Constance means constant in the Roman language. The name Ferdinand, however, is a Germanic name, but is more popular in Spain than it is in Germany. Therefore, Ferdinand may be Adrestia's stand-in as a connection to the Spanish Empire, which is an empire that also had significant influence from the Roman Empire, an empire we already established to be very similar to Adrestia. Additionally, nobility was a huge part of Spanish colonial society, which is why Ferdinand von Eyre probably values it so much. Also, Mercedes was born in a noble house from Adrestia. Although her name reminds us of the German car company, her name is of Spanish origin, which includes her brother Emil. I believe that Mercedes is also Fodlan's similarity to Spain. Spain was a very religious country, using Catholicism as its main source of motivation behind the Reconquista and its era of expansion. Spanish religious enthusiasm is alluded to in Mercedes, since besides her Spanish name, she dresses as a nun and always possesses great loyalty to the goddess. After analyzing the history of the Holy Kingdom of Faerghus, it is made very clear that this country in particular is Fodlan's version of Great Britain, due to the fact that these two nations share very similar histories. Here are my reasons why. The first similarity between the histories of these two countries has to be the way they were created. In regards to England, there were once a group of Germanic peoples called the Anglo-Saxons. However, these Germanic Anglo-Saxons left mainland Europe and invaded the island of Britannia, which was inhabited by the native Celtic tribes. It was on that island that they created their own country, called England, and later on, after years of war, Germanic England would unite with Celtic Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland to become the United Kingdom. In a similar manner, the people of Faerghus were once Adrestians, but at one point in time, they departed from the rest of Fodlan to create their own kingdom in the north, called the Holy Kingdom of Faerghus. In addition, the Celtic natives of Great Britain fought hard against the Roman Empire, who were the first empire to try to colonize the British Isles. Likewise, the people of Faerghus fought hard against the Adrestian Empire to achieve their independence. Another historical similarity between Faerghus and Great Britain is their culture surrounding knights and tales of chivalry. If you have ever watched any of Ash's support conversations, you'll notice that he loves reading books about knights, especially one called Lugh and the Maiden of Wind. In the game, this is a chivalric and almost fairy tale story about King Lugh, who was the first king of Faerghus. This is obviously a direct comparison to Great Britain's story of King Arthur, a mythological hero revered in British literature, with a basis that seems to be a blend of historical inspiration and folklore legend. Just like the tale of Lugh, while both King Arthur and King Lugh are revered in chivalric tales, we could also see a similarity between the national animals of Faerghus and Great Britain, which are both lions. England chose the lion as their national animal as a reference to another legendary king, Richard the Lionheart. Just like England, Faerghus chose the lion as their national animal to pay homage to a king as well, which is of course Lugh. I also mentioned earlier how the natives of the British Isles were also Celtic. Well, it turns out that the name of the Blue Lion's homeland is also Celtic, since the name Faerghus is an anagram to the Celtic word Fergus, which means strong. Most of all, the names of the Blue Lion students hold the most references to British history, further reinforcing the idea that Faerghus is Fodlan's version of Great Britain. Take Dmitri for example. Dmitri is a popular Russian name, but his name, Blaiddyd, is an anagram to Bleydud of Celtic mythology, a fictional king passed on through Brittonic myths in a similar manner to Arthur. Ingrid, however, has a name of Norse origin, which was a popular title among Vikings. Although her name is more common in places like Norway and Sweden, The inclusion of her Norse name could be a connection to how the British Isles were actually colonized by Norse Vikings in the 8th century. As for Sylvain, his first and last name, Gautier, are French. The same applies with Annette, with her first, middle, and last names sounding very French. These French names among the Blue Lions could represent how the French Normans occupied England in the 11th century, which is why some words in the English language are French. As for Felix, his first and last name seem to be of Latin-Roman origin. This is also an allusion to how the Latin-speaking Romans conquered a large portion of the British Isles during ancient times, which is also why many words in the English language have Latin roots. Moving on to the Alliance, it was way harder to connect this country to a specific real-life nation. If we wish to connect the Alliance to an IRL country, let's analyze its history first to see what sets it apart from the rest of Fodlan. First of all, it was the first in Fodlan to stop using a monarchy. Rather, it adopted some form of democracy, where a senate of nobles that acted as representatives vote on the country's decisions, their commander being a leading house that has just a little bit more power above the rest. How did the Alliance obtain their democracy? Well, they revolted against the royalty of Faerghus to achieve their own independence. This makes the Alliance seem a lot like the USA, since in a similar manner, America revolted against the royalty of Britain to achieve status as an independent democracy. So, if Britain and Faerghus are each other's equivalent, then the Alliance and US must also be each other's counterparts, since both of them are alliances or unions of separate territories, ruled under no crown. However, there are still many details proving that the Alliance may be inspired by a different nation. If we want to connect the Alliance to a European nation, we'll need to take a look at its neighboring country first, which is Almyra. First of all, Almyra is not in Fodlan, so it is most likely not a representative of a European nation. Rather, many aspects of Almyra seem to be inspired by the Persian Empire, an Asian country. The Persian Empire was a major power responsible for both conquest and advanced development. Some Persian aspects of Almyra are the use of surwals like the ones seen on Claude. Another example is the national emblem of Almyra, which looks a lot like a symbol from Zoroastrianism, the original Persian religion. Even Claude's crest of Regan resembles that of the crest and star, the symbol of Islam, which is the dominant religion of modern-day Persia. By connecting Almyra to Persia, that now lets us connect the Alliance to a European nation, which is Greece. Just like how Leicester was the first democracy in Fodlan, Greece was the first democracy in both Europe and the entire world. Greece was also at war against the Persian Empire during ancient times. It was during this war that some of the most iconic battles in history took place, such as the battles of Thermopylae and Marathon. In a corresponding manner, the Alliance went toe-to-toe against Almyra on countless occasions. This rivalry between the two countries even became the reason why the Alliance and other nations across Fodlan founded the Officers' Academy. So, not only were Greece and the Alliance the first democracies in their continents, but they were also at war against empires that shared similar elements. However, there is one more nation that the Alliance could have been inspired by, and that being France. You could say that the Alliance is France, since besides Greece, it was the first modern European nation to replace a monarch with a republic during the French Revolution. Now that I've connected the Alliance to 3 different nations, I'll leave it up to you guys in the comment section to choose which one is the most applicable. Moving on to names, the students of the Golden Deer could help support the arguments for each of the 3 nations I've discussed. Take Claude for example. Although his Fodlan name is French, his real name, Khalid, is Arabic, and has popular use in modern-day Persia. So, by connecting Claude and Almyra to Persia, that could help us connect the Alliance to Greece. Speaking of French names, Marianne von Edmond indeed has a French first and last name, which may prove that the Alliance could be inspired by France. Speaking of which, Marianne is the name of France's mascot, just like how America uses Uncle Sam as theirs. This could mean the same for Hilda as well. Although her name is of German origin, it still has popular use in France. Leone, however, has an Italian last name. This could help us prove that the Alliance is inspired by America, mostly because America was in fact named after an Italian man, Amerigo Vespucci. Most of all, the fact that the names of the Golden Deer are so diverse could help us prove that the Alliance was inspired by the USA, since America is mostly defined as a melting pot of different cultures. Specialized classes make up the backbone of Fire Emblem's combat system, so for this next segment, we'll be analyzing the historical inspiration behind some of the game's classes. Let's start with the Myrmidon, which is the beginner sword fighting class. It shares its name with the Myrmidons of Greek mythology. These were the skilled and loyal soldiers of the Greek hero Achilles, who fought alongside him in the Trojan War. Additionally, the hero class sports a look that resembles that of a Roman centurion. However, although many aspects of Fodlan are European, there are still some classes that are of Oriental or Asian origin. This basically shows how Nintendo and Intelligent Systems are still very nationalistic of their Japanese heritage. For example, the Sword Fighter class dons the Kamishomo, which were the robes samurai wore during the Edo period of Japan. The Mortal Savant class bears even more resemblance to Japanese samurai armor. This includes the Menpo mask and their male and female variants. The male version of the class wears the Karuta armor, while the female variant wears what seems to be a kimono. Most of all, the magic classes bear a lot of inspiration from the Catholic Church. These include the light magic or healing classes, who wear garments similar to the Catholic clergy. This may allude to the historical role the Church had during wartime, since wounded knights and soldiers would often seek Catholic monasteries in order to be treated. The dark and black magic classes, however, don't have a very bright or benevolent look as their healer counterparts. These classes wear a mask that resembles that of medieval plague doctors, who were responsible for treating victims of the Black Plague during the 1300s. And by that, we mean using ineffective methods, such as bloodletting and frogs. The beaks on their masks were used to store herbs that would block out the scent of both the diseased and the deceased. Even faith and reason, two subjects your units could learn, were real parts of education in Western Europe. Although they were not healing or attack magic, their names match the two philosophical and theological elements that received much attention in medieval universities. In addition to classes, weapons in Three Houses hold significant historical value as well. Take the javelin for example. The javelin shares its design with the Roman pilum, which was a throwing spear designed to break apart upon impact, so the enemy can't throw it back at you. The rapier is also a real-life sword, which were blades designed for jabbing, and were popular in countries like Spain and Italy. Another sword, the Sword of Seiros, also has a design resemblant of the Zweihander, a German sword used to push away pikes and long spears. The killer knuckles are also based on the Indian Katar, a gauntlet that lets you brutally stab your opponents whilst punching them at the same time. Another Indian weapon in this game is the Vashra Mushti, which shares its name with a pair of Indian wrestling knuckles. Upon studying their backstories and motivation, it becomes apparent that the house leaders in particular are based on real-life historical figures. Let's start with Claude. Remember how Claude is from Almyra, a country we previously associated with ancient Persia? Well, Claude might have been based on a real Persian king, Cyrus the Great. You see, one of Claude's principal values is tolerance. After a childhood of discrimination, Claude grew to despise all forms of prejudice and desires a world where all religions and ethnicities are accepted. These are pretty much the values of Cyrus the Great. While the other empires forced a state-mandated religion or put unequal taxes on minority religions, Cyrus the Great ordered a universal policy of religious tolerance in his empire. Overall, Claude and Cyrus the Great were not only monarchs of similar nations, but held high regard toward the equal treatment of their subjects. Edelgard, probably the most important character in all four routes, has the most indistinguishable real-life counterpart, Napoleon Bonaparte. The reason being, these legendary emperors share identical motives and even stories. Emperor Napoleon of France is known in some nations' history books as a warmongering villain, Even the wars he fought in were amply named after him. However, Napoleon did have a reason for fighting these wars. Young Bonaparte saw the blatant inequality that riddled Europe. Men were often promoted based on the noble status of their families, never their own merit. Therefore, this inspired Napoleon to fight these wars in the first place, with the motivation of reforming Europe's social structure. Rather than promoting members of society based on blood, Napoleon strove for a Europe that promoted citizens based on personal merit. This is identical with Edelgard's motivation, since she despised how Fodlan promoted members of society based on whether or not they were born with a crest. Therefore, her wars were started with the motivation of replacing a system of crests with a system of meritism, much like her French counterpart. Not only were these emperors' motivations identical, but their rise to power was as well. After staging a coup and taking over the French Republic, Napoleon decided to become Emperor of France. Usually, a Catholic archbishop would crown an emperor's head, but at Napoleon's coronation, he grabbed the crown before the archbishop, put it on his own head, making himself emperor. Edelgard did pretty much the same thing. Without the permission of Archbishop Rhea, she went to Enbar herself, and without the presence of the church, took her own initiative to be crowned Adrestian emperor. Besides their rise to power, Edelgard and Napoleon's downfall are also identical. You see, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, a battle where a multitude of nations had to fight together just to defeat and eventually arrest Napoleon. In Verdant Wind and Azure Moon, the Battle of Gronderfield was also a clash with multiple major nations. It was at this battle where the tide of war was eventually turned, and Edelgard's army was forced to move back to Enbar, leading up to her death. So in the end, Edelgard and Napoleon went down in history as emperors with justifiable motives, but questionable methods. After so many historical connections found in this game, there still is a bigger picture to be found. Besides all the trivial comparisons we found between this game and IRL history, I believe this game's connection to history serves a way bigger purpose. There has to be a reason why so many characters and countries seem so resemblant to the real world to begin with. I believe this is the game's way of conveying a message. You see, every story has a theme for its viewer, which is a broad message about life. Many of us probably know Three Houses' universal main theme, which is that good times are never permanent. However, I think this theme in particular helps us uncover multiple messages in the story. By playing all the routes, this one lesson helps us uncover another important theme. It's to never jump to conclusions, but rather to always acknowledge another person's perspective. This message is uncovered when the game shows us each character portrayed at a completely different angle. As you can see, every character has cherished memories, and without the professor's guidance, they will stop at nothing just to experience those memories again, even if it means shedding innocent blood. Each character has a desire just to return to a past state of euphoria. Whether they are on your side or not, it is never in your right to judge them just through one lens. In the end, this might be the game's true connection to history. When it comes to studying historical events, it's always important to acknowledge the perspective of all sides. It's not always that everyone on one side of a war was completely good or evil. Sometimes bad guys and good guys could be found on both sides of a historical conflict. Most of all, the game's connection to history is also its message about our lives as a whole. It's never right to completely judge someone as a person just because of different opinions or because you are viewing them from just one angle. In fact, that is why we study history in the first place. Studying the achievements and wrongdoings of historical figures tells us what to do and what not to do in our lives. So in the end, even if you don't like Three Houses as a game, it still is an impactful story. A unique and imperfect one in that, although your main protagonist is a professor, ironically, the narrative treats you as if you are a student learning not one, but multiple lessons from the story. To be honest, I actually want more stories like this in the future. A journey with more than one lesson to learn, even if it means being as flawed as this wonderful game. With that being said, thank you so much for reaching this part of the video. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like, And if you have friends who enjoy Fire Emblem Three Houses, make sure to share this with them as well. Also, if you want to see more content where I analyze video game lore, especially Fire Emblem, please consider subscribing, since I have more videos planned for the future, including ones about different games. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be glad to see you on the next video.